Today we're going to take a walk through the garden and see what it looks like after it's been cleaned up for fall. This is such a refreshing time of year once the gardens have all been cleaned up, put to bed, and just kind of sitting in their dormancy period until next spring when things will emerge. Hi, I'm Heidi from Garden Crossings, and we're going to go ahead and take a walk through the garden today and just show you what we've done in our garden to get it prepared for fall. I'll start off here in the front of the house, and a lot of what we did for fall decor has been removed. You can see all the garden mums have been removed. They got hit by frost and look kind of bad, so we pulled them out. Some of the containers are still looking okay-ish from a distance. This one here has a Caryopteris shrub in it, which is done flowering. That lemon coral sedum is still holding on good. The pepper plants, the foliage is junk, but the peppers are still pretty. Even the marigolds, the plant is black, but from a distance you can see those beautiful splashes of orange. So still holding on until we transform to winter. The hanging baskets, those are doing really good actually. They've got the toffee twist carex grass in the center. There's heuchera or corabels in there, along with some lysmachia and peppers, and those handled the frost no problem. This planter up front here, thank goodness for the pansies up front, because pretty much everything in the back is looking pretty ratty. The mums are no good. The creeping Jenny's looking pretty good yet. I think this was a kale. Look at that, all mushy and gross. So yeah, good thing we put the party in the front, because the business in the back is looking terrible. So the gardeners have gone through and done all of the fall trimming in the landscape. So we're going to just take a walk and see what they've trimmed, what they haven't trimmed. I want this video to be, I wanted to give you confidence in what you're doing. So many times people just make it so hard, or make gardening harder than what it needs to be. So I take a pretty low-key approach with trimming, and my motto is just hack it. So there's a lot of things that have been trimmed back, but we'll talk about the things that shouldn't get trimmed as well. So up front here, these are the bobo hydrangeas. We took about a third off the top, shaped them up really nicely. Those bloom off of the new growth, so that's not a problem with trimming your panicle hydrangeas this time of year. The proudberry, we just left this as is because these berries are so pretty right now. So we're just going to kind of leave that and let it go until it doesn't look good, and then in the spring that one will get a nice shaping. All right, this here is a lilac tree. Do not trim your lilacs. Your lilacs bloom off of your previous season's growth, and if you trim them, you will not have flowers next spring. So even though it may be tempting to get it shaped up, I tell you what, this is tempting for me to have them shape this one up, but I know we can't do it. So after it's done blooming in the spring, this lilac will get a nice shaping. This was the quick fire hydrangea, and it was over 8 foot tall, almost 8 to 10 foot tall. So I had the gardeners cut it in half. So it's about 4 foot tall right now, and it was just getting huge and out of control. So this will help keep it, at least for next year, at a little bit more manageable size. Quick fire has been discontinued, but again, it was a panicle hydrangea. It is a panicle hydrangea, so it does bloom off of the new growth. Making our way down, these are some more bobos that line the path, and I had them trim them in half, get them nicely shaped. There's also some pugster butterfly bush. I did not have them touch the pugsters, and the reason is because butterfly bush here in Michigan, we're a zone 5B, 6A. Pugsters not pugsters, but butterfly bush in general can be a little sensitive to the cold winters if we get a really cold winter. So I kept all of the top growth on just to add extra protection. We'll see in the spring. If the growth all comes back from the base, then we'll trim all these sticks off. But if the growth comes off of these old twigs, then we'll leave them, because that will just give that plant that much quicker of a start towards blooming next season. Also, if you remember from videos, there was a giant hydrangea in this area. Like, it almost filled in this whole little area. And you can really tell there's not a lot of plants in here because the hydrangea just kind of covered everything. This is now 18 inches tall, and we should have trimmed it earlier when we put the new air conditioner in, but there were bees and it was buzzing, and we didn't want to get in there and do that. So this fall, I had the gardeners trim this way back as well. And now next year, this will be more manageable. As it gets big, we can trim it away from the air conditioner. We're not going to let it get as big. And this just makes it more manageable that way. Some of the plants in this garden, we have some, what is this? This is Euphorbia bonfire. So that one they left, they didn't trim back. It could have been trimmed back, but I think they left it because it's got a little bit of interesting foliage right now. Hardy hibiscus was trimmed back to the ground. Now this is not going to be the popular opinion to do in the fall, but we do trim all of our hardy hibiscus back to the ground in the fall. So we have time to get the cleanup done, because otherwise spring is planting time, fall is cleanup time for us. One thing they did leave here is a sage. So Russian sage is another plant, kind of like the hibiscus, that they typically recommend trimming in the spring. Now, I don't have a problem myself if they were to trim this. I think it still would have been fine. But Russian sage is one of those plants that maybe you might want to be a little bit cautious on trimming, depending on where you live in the fall. A lot of smooth hydrangeas also were in this garden bed. This was the Incredible Blush, and this just got probably about 2 foot taken off the top. All the cone flowers have been removed. The Nepeta, I'm trying to remember what all was in these beds. But obviously you can see if there was a perennial in this bed, it's gone, with the exception there of the Lenten Rose that we did leave because it's got nice evergreen foliage, and that's an early spring blooming perennial. So Lenten Rose or hellebore did not get trimmed back. Also the Delosperma, which is a tight, low growing ground cover. It's just so compact and short. There's no real need to trim it back. The only thing some people might want to do is if it's getting out of control and spreading more than they want, is just ripping some of it out. All right. In the front of this garden bed, there is some dianthus, and we left those because they're just so low growing. We did remove the flowers off, but because the plant's not that tall, it really didn't need to be trimmed. Some of the things in this garden that were trimmed were my favorite. They're the Alstroemeria. That's been trimmed back. There was a Stilby. There was Jacob's Ladder, daylilies. Oh, just trying to remember all the things. All trimmed back. The only thing that didn't get trimmed back in this little area, there's a couple corabels that really aren't doing that great, but those did not get trimmed back. They need to find a different home. They're probably getting buried by all the other things. And then again, another Lenten Rose did not get trimmed. With shrubs, we'll talk about them here. This is the Weigela Snippet Lime. This one just got a very light trimming, which Weigela typically do bloom off of the previous season's growth. So there is a chance we may not see flowers on this one next spring. So we'll have to wait and see. In the middle here is a hydrangea. This is a little Quickfire. This is a panicle hydrangea. So this one can get trimmed because it blooms off of the new growth. So at some point, with these shrubs that bloom in the spring off of the old growth, at some point I'm like, they need to be trimmed just to get them all kind of shaped and sized. And that's what I wanted the girls to do here when they were trimming in this bed, is get those 3 shrubs so that they were all very uniform in height. So sacrificing blooms does on occasion have to happen to get the results that you want, especially if you're not out in your garden, you know, in the summer doing your trimming, which we don't do much trimming around here in the summer. Just maybe deadheading is the trimming extent that we do. So we are talking a lot about perennials or lack thereof because they have all been trimmed back, and I've been touching on the shrubs as well. So things you should not prune in the fall. We mentioned there was that Russian sage there. We mentioned the rose mallow, hardy hibiscus, which I do trim, but that's not recommended. With shrubs, there's a different kind of rule of thumb there. So with flowering shrubs particularly, some bloom off of the new growth and some bloom off of the old growth. This is not a hard and fast rule, but a lot of times you're going to find your spring blooming shrubs are the ones that bloom off of the previous season's growth. So you want to make sure that you're not trimming that growth in the fall, otherwise you won't have those flowers in the spring. So here is the dwarf lilac. This did not get trimmed because it's already, setting its buds for next season. So we did not do any trimming here on this dwarf lilac. This will get trimmed next spring after it's done flowering, if we so choose. Also, we have the Weigela. This is the My Monet Weigela. These did not get trimmed either because these would be a spring blooming shrub. Roses. A lot of people will say not to do too much trimming on roses in the fall, which we didn't do a lot of trimming. We just took kind of the top little bit off, removed all the old buds, the old rose hips, and just kind of shaped out the top of the shrub a little bit. So this one will be good and should bloom beautifully next year. It's Atlas rose. It's always a beautiful rose. In the middle of the bed here, we'll get back to where we can see it. That is a hydrangea standard. So basically it's a hardy hydrangea that's been trained into tree form. And this we took back quite heavily. And the reason is the flowers get so big on this plant that it gets a little lopsided. So if we trim it back a little bit, it just kind of helps so that we don't get so many flowers next year. They're big, but there's not as many. And I don't want this tree to just be so big. I want it to stay nice and compact. So it's just a personal preference for myself. We could let it go and not trim it, but my preference is to keep it tight and tightly flowering. Under the deck, well, we have some hanging baskets that have to get removed. This is sure sign of frosty death. They actually did really good though for the whole season, and they didn't get much water because they're not on drip. So the only time they get watered is if we remembered, every couple weeks. All right, that's the beauty of ferns though. So under here was mostly all hostas. There are some Lenten rose or hellebore in here, so those did not get trimmed. Also, there are a few black-eyed Susans and a Rebecca. These could have been trimmed back, so I'm not sure why they didn't trim them, but it's okay. Like, we can come through and get them trimmed back. These little seedlings in here of black-eyed Susans, which I'm okay with that because I think they add just kind of a little splash of color in this mostly shady garden bed. The Stilbees were trimmed back. It looks like they even trimmed the Bernera back just a little bit. Making our way through. There's some Dianthus that are lining the bed here. Those did not get trimmed, just the flowers removed. Catnip's been trimmed back. Daylilies, columbine. Along the house there, those are smooth hydrangeas, so those were trimmed. I think they took about 18 inches off of those just to keep them below the window. In this area is more cone flowers, columbine. It's funny, as I'm looking in the plants I'm remembering, of course I'm remembering the more popular type plants, but I'm like, man, I need to diversify these gardens a little bit. It's kind of like all the same plants. When I've got so many choices to choose from, I don't know, I must just have my go-tos. This is an older part of the garden, so this part was done several years ago. So we haven't added a whole ton of new things in since this was originally done. So that's probably why it's more of our tried and true, more of our original plants that we ever grew. So yeah, everything in here has pretty much been trimmed back. These plants here, these are actually Gerber daisies. These are annuals, and for whatever reason, they've come back for probably about 8 years now. So we did leave the foliage on those just to give them a little extra protection through the winter. And we could have trimmed them back and they probably would have been fine, but just because we know they're not supposed to be coming back every year, leaving that extra foliage is just, like I said, extra protection, giving them just kind of like a little bit of a blanket in the winter. Black-eyed Susans trimmed back, Amsonia, daylilies. Here we have some lavender. The lavender did not get trimmed back. So typically we don't do a lot of trimming on the lavender, maybe removing the flowers, which didn't happen here, but you could remove the flowers if you want, but not a lot of trimming would be recommended for your lavenders. behind the lavenders are mini mauvette hydrangeas, smooth hydrangeas, and those just got kind of a nice little shaping to them. We are going to make our way around the side of the barn because I want to show you two things. One is the ornamental grass. Ornamental grasses can get trimmed in the fall, but with this one we chose not to because I love how it adds motion in the garden. And I also love the look of ornamental grasses in the fall. I just think they're so beautiful. So this will get trimmed back in the spring. This is the morning light grass, and doesn't that look beautiful? Just a little bit of a rosy hue there on those plumes. They're so fluffy right now. It's such a beautiful grass. And to be honest, well, I think it's about the only grass in the garden actually. Next to it though are the Tough Stuff hydrangeas, and this is what I wanted to show you. So these Tough Stuff hydrangeas were over 5 foot tall. They do bloom on the old growth and new growth. So by trimming them in the fall, we are more than likely sacrificing our first round of blooms. Now I knew that was going to happen, but they were just getting so big. They were hanging over the grass. Let me back up a little bit. You can see where the grass is kind of black and dirt because it didn't get any sunlight. So we did trim these back, and sometimes you just have to do it. And if things aren't looking good or if they're taking up too much space, just do it. Don't be afraid. No, you might be sacrificing something, but sometimes sacrifices have to be made. So these bloom beautifully, 2 cycles of blooms this year. So I may not get that first cycle, but we will get the second cycle of blooms, which occurs off of the new growth. And with trimming these, did I have them, go in and, go down 3 inches, find the first nod, trim in? No. That's not how we trim. When we trim, we just go in and we trim. I said, I want them at about 3.5 foot, trim them. So that's what they did. They went ahead and trimmed them at about 3.5 foot. There was no paying attention to where on that branch it was getting trimmed. Now, some people are going to say, Heidi, that's bad advice. Well, you know what? Gardening can be made easy, or gardening can be made tricky. If you prefer to be a gardener that likes to be doing everything by the rules, that's great. But there's a lot of us out there that don't have time to be rule followers. We need to break the rules and make things easier. That's kind of how we do things in our garden. And so far, I haven't had too many times where I thought to myself, oh, I wish I wouldn't have done that. So it's kind of the, how do I say it? Make garden easier for yourself. Don't make it too stressful. In the butterfly garden, you can see there is as I'm looking, there are no perennials that remain. They have all been trimmed back. A few of the shrubs, so let me go back. In the butterfly garden, there was milkweed, there's phlox, lots of phlox, daylilies, lupin, columbine, amsonia, sedum, nepeta, delphinium, spigilla, all kinds of various perennials. They've all been trimmed. Bobo hydrangeas, those got trimmed back again to, they're a little bit over 2 foot, so about 2.5 foot. And last year we did a pretty extensive video series on trimming hydrangeas. So if you are wondering how to trim hydrangeas or want to watch it be done, go back to our YouTube channel around October of 2022, and there's about 5 different videos on how to trim hydrangeas. So you might find those very helpful. This is the Miss Molly butterfly bush. I had them not trim this year. Again, it's a butterfly bush and they can be tender here. So we'll see next spring, does the new growth come back from the base or does it come off of the old twigs? If it does come off of the old twigs, we're gonna still trim it in the spring back to about 2 foot because I don't want it to be this big to start with already in April or May. So once we can decide where the new growth is coming from, it'll get trimmed back to 2 foot or it'll get trimmed back to probably about 10 inches if it's coming back from the base. So by leaving all that foliage on there, hopefully that will just give it some added protection from the snow and the winter winds. Another bulbo hydrangea trimmed back nicely. This area here, so there's some monarda there. That monarda could have got trimmed back to the base. So sometimes, some people will leave it up though because there's seeds in there that the birds enjoy. So that's kind of a personal preference, but it's not because it can't be trimmed. It's probably because they left them for the seeds for the birds. Making their way through. Anemone. This is an anemone that's been trimmed back. This is Amsonia. And that actually could have got trimmed back to the base. So that one could have got trimmed back much further. Clematis has all been trimmed. This is the diamond ball and the Viva Polonia, and that's now 6 inches tall. We'll be talking more about clematis as we continue in this video and get to more of my clematis beds. So if you want more information on clematis, just continue along here. But yeah, nicely cleaned up. So there's something so refreshing, I think, about having a fall garden that has been trimmed back pretty much everything in it. Because this just tells me next spring, there's not much work that's going to need to be done as far as trimming and maintenance. A little weeding, of course, but as far as perennial and shrub trimming, it's all been done. So it's next spring, means it's time to plant. Firelight hydrangea, we just did a little trimming on that, maybe about a foot or so, just taking the blooms off. These are sedum underneath of it, along with some tall phlox. This is a Weigela Sonic Bloom Pink Weigela, and this is a spring blooming plant, but for some reason this plant did not do very good this year. It got really big, didn't flower a lot. It's supposed to flower 3 cycles. It always has, but for whatever reason this year it didn't do it. So I had the girls go ahead and trim it back because it was so big. So I am sacrificing that first cycle of blooms knowingly. But yeah, we'll see how it does. If it blooms, 2 times next year and blooms nicely, I'll be happy. If I don't get any rounds of blooms, it might be time for it to go and get replaced with something else. So we'll see. This plant has been an absolutely fabulous addition to this garden for as long as this garden has been here, and I've been really pleased with it. But for whatever reason, we'll see if last year was a fluke or if it's kind of the new norm. Heading over to the Hosta beds, you'll notice there is no Hosta. So Hostas are one of the plants that when I was telling the gardeners, I'm like, get the Hostas out of here, because I hate slimy plants once they get frostbite. They get all slimy and gross. So I was telling the girls, I'm like, go ahead and tackle them Hostas. I said, because they're going to be disgusting once they get hit by a frost. So they were pretty happy to be able to get them cut back before they got slimy and gross. So the only thing left in this area are a few of the Lenten roses, and those are evergreen and early spring bloomers, so we leave those. But all of the hostas have been trimmed back. All that stuff you're seeing, that's all on my neighbor's side, so that's not our stuff. Pulmonaria did not get trimmed back because that is also an evergreen and it's a nice spring bloomer, so they did not trim that back at all. Looks like there's some carex back there, some carex banana boat grass that did not get trimmed. The hydrangea is a smooth hydrangea, so that did get trimmed. There are a few big leaf hydrangeas out here. We don't have many big leaf in our garden because they just don't bloom faithfully here for us in Michigan, so we don't have many. But this one that we have, this I think is Let's Dance Can Do, or Can. This one they did not trim, and that one does do nice. So that is one of my favorite. Let's Dance Ariba and Let's Dance Can. Those are my favorite of the reblooming hydrangeas in the big leaf family as of date. Huge little patch there. Huge little. That was kind of contradicting. But a beautiful patch there of the Lenten rose, evergreen, so they don't get trimmed back. And great spring bloomers. In this bed, there are some corbels, which we do not trim. Astilbe gets trimmed. Daylilies get trimmed. Hostas get trimmed. Anemone is out here, that gets trimmed. Some Nepeta. catnip, all those things all get trimmed. There's a few Atlas roses and bobos. They got just a nice little shaping to them as well. There is some lavender in this bed, and the lavender we did not trim. Here's another Monarda, and they did not trim this, and I think again it's because of those seed heads. They left the seed heads for the birds. But the Monarda can get trimmed if you want to get in there and trim. It's just so nice, like I said, nice and refreshing to have everything just trimmed back. So in this back little corner here, we had a huge, beautiful Henry Ayler's Rebecca that kind of took over the whole garden, even though it's simply just this one plant here. But that was such a beautiful fall blooming plant. In this area, there is anemone, tall phlox, a lot of hardy hibiscus, daylilies that have all been trimmed. Here, actually, I do have some more ornamental grasses in my garden. Looky here. So these, I don't even know which ones these are, to be honest. That's probably Carl Forrester. This is a panicum of some sort, but who knows which one. So they did leave those for the fall, blowing in the breeze interest, and things are definitely windy right now. This is an incredible hydrangea. This last year was huge. It filled in that whole space. So we ripped a ton of it out and got it all back to the main mother plant, and now it is 3 foot that they've trimmed that back to for the fall. Invincible Spirit hydrangea has been trimmed back to 2 foot. The spirea, they kind of shaped the spirea up, gave them just a nice little light trim. So both of these structures here have clematis that grow on them, and the clematis on both of these have been trimmed back to 6 or 8 inches or so. So that is one thing with clematis, is that's another plant. How do I trim? When do I trim? Where do I trim? All those questions. Because there's clematis in prune group 1, 2, and 3. What does that mean? You know, does it mean, do I trim it? When? How? So confusing, right? People get scared of clematis because they don't know what to do with them and when to do it. So I have all the different prune groups planted in my garden in various different areas, and you have not seen one clematis that has not been trimmed. So they all have been trimmed back to about 4 to 6 inches or so. These here are more like 12 inches, and I think it's just because they're such big plants that they couldn't get into the chicken wire any closer. We trim all of our clematis back in the fall. And like I said, we've got various different prune groups of clematis. They all bloom every year. Now, what I might be doing is I might be sacrificing the first round of blooms. But as long as they're all blooming, that's what makes me happy. And the fact that they were all cleaned up going into the spring, that also makes me happy. So you can pay attention to your little tags in the prune groups and what it tells you when to trim, which a lot of that information is also very confusing online because there's a lot of conflicting information talking about the same prune groups. So any clematis pretty much that you're going to buy from us, if you trim it back in the fall, it'll flower for you next spring. So don't let clematis be tricky, because they're a really great plant to have in the garden. You can tell this Wine and Roses Weigela got hit by the frost. Very crunchy looking. The limelight hydrangea, I did not have them trim, and not for any particular purpose or reason. Well, there is a reason actually. The only reason I did not have them trim this is I might need to come in and trim these branches for our winter porch pots. So as you can see right now, I don't have a lot to use because they've all been trimmed back. So I had them leave this one. That way, if I need to, I can get probably another 50 or 75 blooms that we can use for our winter season when we're creating our beautiful porch pots. So they are definitely past prime. They should have been trimmed probably about 6 weeks ago. That way they would have had pretty white shades and pink shades. But at this point, anything that we can use in those containers is fine. They can get spray painted. If you're into spray painting things, you could spray paint them white or red or whatever color you wanted for a little splash of color. But this natural look too, I think, is very, very pleasing to the eye when creating those winter porch pots. So my intention with this video was hopefully not to make you more confused than what it can be with gardening. I'm hoping that I took a pretty laid back, low-key, simplistic approach to doing fall cleanup. Like I said, so many people are worried about trimming and how and when and where and what and all that. And I want to show you that you can go out in the garden and you can trim. You don't have to worry about the where you're trimming or how much you're trimming. Plants are forgiving, and look, in most cases they're gonna come back beautiful for you next year. Like I said, there's some exceptions. There's always exceptions to the rule. I pointed out a few of the plants that we didn't trim: the dianthus, the lavender, definitely your shrubs that bloom in the spring. You know, you don't want to trim those shrubs that bloom in the spring because the flowers are already setting in those twigs that are out there. And if you know your plant is your shrub is a shrub that blooms on the old growth, you certainly don't want to trim those either. So if you're confused about your plants, shrubs primarily, do they bloom on old or new growth? Should they be trimmed or shouldn't they be trimmed in the fall? Please leave your questions below. And perennials too. If you've got perennials that you're like, okay, Heidi, I know you said just trim those perennials, but if you're nervous, hesitant, leave the comment below. I'll let you know if it's safe to trim or not to trim at this point in the season. Again, like I said, leave your state and the zone you're gardening in. That's helpful information with the advice that I give you, because different zones, different areas may have different information that I would share with you. Thanks for watching. I'm Heidi from Garden Crossings.